October 14, 1943. 23,000 feet over central Germany, south of the city of Aachen. A formation of American heavy bombers has just watched its fighter escort peel away and turn for home, fuel tanks dry, unable to go a mile further into the Reich. Ahead lie 300 miles of hostile sky and a small Bavarian town called Schweinfurt. Behind and above, closing fast, come the German fighters, hundreds of them, flown by pilots who know exactly where the little friends always have to turn back. The men in the bombers call their aircraft the Flying Fortress. The doctrine that sent them here made a promise. A bomber heavy with machine guns, flying in a tight box alongside hundreds of others, could shoot its way to any target in Germany in broad daylight and come home again without an escort at all. Over the next 3 hours, that promise is going to be tested to destruction over a single German town. By nightfall, the 8th Air Force will have lost more men in one afternoon than RAF Fighter Command lost in the entire Battle of Britain. This is the story of the B-17 Flying Fortress, and the day the theory that built it flew into a trap. This is how it happened. To understand the trap, you have to understand the idea that led the crews into it. In the years between the wars, air power theorists on both sides of the Atlantic settled on a belief that hardened into doctrine. The bomber would always get through. A British Prime Minister said those words out loud in 1932, and men who planned wars believed them. The theory held that a large enough formation of well-armed bombers, flying high and tight, could defend itself with its own guns. Fighters would come, and fighters would die on the massed fire of the boxes, and the survivors would press on and put their bombs on the factory that mattered. The Americans took this further than anyone. The United States Army Air Forces staked their whole strategy on daylight precision bombing. They would fly in daylight when the crews could see the target, and they would aim with the Norden bomb sight, a device its makers claimed could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The Royal Air Force had already tried daylight raids, taken savage losses, and retreated into the darkness to bomb German cities by night. The Americans were sure they could do what the British could not. They had the Flying Fortress. The aircraft was built to make the doctrine real. The B-17 was a 4-engine heavy bomber, and by 1943 the version carrying the war was the B-17F, with the first of the improved G models just reaching the squadrons. For Wright Cyclone radial engines, each one a 9-cylinder air-cooled power plant of roughly 1,200 horsepower, and every one of them fed by a turbo supercharger. Those turbochargers were the heart of the design. They forced air into the engines at high altitude, so the Fortress kept its power where thinner air robbed other aircraft of theirs. It could cruise above 20,000 feet and climb toward a ceiling near 35,000, up in the freezing subarctic air where German flak had to strain to reach it and German fighters clawed for room to maneuver. A late-model Fortress carried as many as 1350 caliber Browning machine guns, in the nose, in a powered turret on its back, in a ball turret slung under its belly at each waist window, and in the tail. 10 men flew and fought her. Pilot and co-pilot, navigator and bombardier in the nose, a flight engineer manning the top turret, a radio operator, the ball turret gunner curled inside his glass sphere, 2 waist gunners, and the tail gunner alone at the back. Fly hundreds of these machines in a stacked, overlapping formation the planners called the combat box, and every bomber sat inside a cone of crossfire thrown up by all the others. On paper, nothing could live inside that cone. That was the promise the medal was meant to keep. Flying the Fortress into Germany was an ordeal before a single fighter appeared. At 25,000 feet, the air outside the aluminum skin was colder than 50 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze bare skin to metal in seconds. The bombers were not pressurized, so every man breathed bottled oxygen through a rubber mask for 5 and 6 hours at a stretch, and a cracked line or a valve iced shut could kill a gunner quietly while the crew around him kept fighting. The 2 waist gunners stood at open windows in a 150-mile-an-hour slipstream, working heavy machine guns in electrically heated suits that failed as often as they held. Across the campaign, frostbite put more men in the hospital than German bullets did. The ball turret gunner rode below the aircraft, folded into a sphere of glass and steel barely large enough to hold him. 5 miles of empty air beneath his back. That was the office 10 young men reported to for work, before anyone had fired a shot. There was one flaw in the theory, and everyone who studied it could see it. The bombers could reach deep into Germany. The fighters that protected them could not. In 1943, no Allied fighter had the fuel to fly all the way to a target like Schweinfurt and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a big and capable escort, ran out of range near the German border. Beyond that line, the bombers were on their own, exactly as the doctrine said they should be. The planners chose to believe the guns would be enough. The target they picked to prove it was one of the most tempting on any map. Schweinfurt, in northern Bavaria, held the factories that made roughly half of Germany's ball bearings. Ball bearings go inside every engine, every gearbox, every gun turret and aircraft and tank the German war machine built. Cripple Schweinfurt, the argument ran, and you seized the whole of German industry by a single joint and squeeze. It was a clean and elegant theory. It was also about to meet the Luftwaffe. The Americans had already been to Schweinfurt once. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force threw a double strike at the ball bearing works and at an aircraft plant in Regensburg. 376 bombers went out. 60 did not come back, and hundreds of airmen were killed or captured in a single day. The raid hurt the factories, but German production recovered within weeks, and the cost had been frightening. Any sober reading of that August day said the escort problem had to be solved before anyone went back. It was not solved. Through the early autumn, the 8th kept flying deeper, into Stuttgart and Münster, and the losses kept climbing. Then the weather over Germany cleared for a few days in the middle of October, and the commanders decided to finish the job they had started in August. They would send the bombers back to Schweinfurt without the escort they knew they needed, and trust the boxes to hold. The mission was set for the 14th. If you are enjoying this look at the machines and the decisions that shaped the air war, a quick subscribe helps the channel reach more people who like their history told straight. 291 flying fortresses lifted off from bases across eastern England that morning and clawed their way into formation through thick cloud. Assembling hundreds of heavy bombers into their combat boxes was slow and dangerous work, and the weather scattered the plan before the coast of Europe was even in sight. The P-47 escorts took the bombers as far as their fuel allowed, to the frontier near Aachen, and then, one by one, they waggled their wings and turned for home. The German controllers had watched this happen on raid after raid. They knew the escorts' turnback line as well as the Americans did, and they had massed their fighters just beyond it. As the last Thunderbolt disappeared to the west, the Luftwaffe came in. They came in numbers no one in the formation had ever seen, wave after wave, perhaps 300 fighters that day, landing to rearm and refuel and climbing back up to attack again and again until the Americans had flown some 500 separate interceptions. The Germans opened at a distance the bombers could not answer. Twin-engine heavy fighters, the Messerschmitt 110s and the Me 410s, stood off beyond the range of the 50 caliber guns and fired rockets into the boxes. 21-centimeter mortar shells lobbed from tubes under their wings and fused to burst inside the tight American formations. A single rocket bursting in the right place could knock a bomber out of the sky or blow a hole in the box that the single-engine fighters then poured through. Behind the rockets came the Focke-Wulf 190s and the Messerschmitt 109s, and they had learned to attack from dead ahead, closing on the bomber's thin nose armor at a combined speed of over 500 miles an hour, firing cannon in the half-second before they flashed through the formation and were gone. The gunners had seconds, sometimes less. The sky filled with tracer, with burning aircraft, with parachutes and falling engines and the long smoke trails of fortresses going down. The formations were torn apart from the front. The 305th Bomb Group, flying near the head of the stream, lost 13 of its 16 aircraft, most of them shot down before the target was even in sight. The 306th lost 10. Whole squadrons vanished from the sky in minutes, and still the survivors flew on, holding formation because holding formation was the only defense they had. The running battle lasted the better part of 3 hours across the round trip. And here is the thing the crews earned in blood that day. They put their bombs on the target. Of the 291 that set out, 229 reached Schweinfurt and bombed. The formations that arrived over the factories bombed with real accuracy, planting scores of hits across the ball-bearing works, 88 of them square on the 2 main plants. The men who reached the target did everything the doctrine asked of them. Then they turned around and flew back through the same gauntlet to the sea. The cost is written plainly in the record. 60 flying fortresses were shot down, and another ditched in the channel on the way home. 17 more were so badly damaged they never flew again. 121 came back with battle damage of every kind. Out of 291 bombers, 77 were destroyed or written off in a single afternoon, a loss rate above 26%. Roughly 650 airmen did not come back. Most were listed as missing, some were dead in the aircraft that made it home, and 65 came down over Germany and spent the rest of the war as prisoners. It was the worst day the 8th Air Force had yet suffered, and it earned the 14th of October a name the crews would use for the rest of their lives. Black Thursday. The bombs had fallen true, and it still was not enough. The raid did hurt Schweinfurt, and bearing production fell in the weeks that followed. But Germany had reserves of ball bearings stockpiled, and Albert Speer's armaments ministry moved fast, dispersing the machinery to smaller plants scattered across the country and buying bearings from neutral Sweden and Switzerland. Within a few months output had recovered, and the single joint the planners had hoped to seize turned out to have far more give in it than they believed. One town, however important, was not the throat of German industry, and no target was worth a quarter of your bombers every time you visited it. The arithmetic was final. The 8th Air Force could not go back to Schweinfurt or to any target that deep until something changed. Deep raids into Germany without escort stopped. For the rest of 1943, the bombers struck only where friendly fighters could still cover them. The theory that a bomber could always get through, alone, in daylight, had been carried all the way to a German ball-bearing town and broken there. What broke it also pointed to the answer, and the answer was not a better bomber. It was a fighter that could go the whole way. Through the winter, the Americans pushed a new escort into service and hung drop tanks under its wings, the North American P-51 Mustang, a fighter with the range to fly to Berlin and back and the performance to beat the Germans when it got there. When the 8th returned to the deep targets in force, at the great series of raids in February 1944 that the crews called Big Week, the little friends came all the way with them. This time the German fighters that rose to meet the bombers found American fighters waiting, and it was the Luftwaffe's turn to bleed. Across the spring of 1944, the German day fighter force was ground down in the sky over its own country, and the bombers Schweinfurt had savaged flew on to help win the air war outright. The Flying Fortress went on to become the enduring symbol of that war, more than 12,000 built. The aircraft the crews trusted to bring them home shot to pieces and still flying. It kept that faith more often than any machine had a right to. But that came later. On the evening of the 14th of October, 1943, none of it was settled. At bases across eastern England, the ground crews stood on the Hardstands and counted the aircraft coming back over the fence, and counted the ones that did not, and stopped counting when the sky stayed empty. 60 Hardstands were bare that night. The men who had believed a bomber could defend itself learned, in a single afternoon over Schweinfurt, exactly what that belief had cost, and exactly what it would take to make it true.